The afternoon sun hung low over Oro Bay, New Guinea, on the 14th of July, 1943. Captain William Grayson squinted through the salt-crusted windscreen of his North American B-25 Mitchell, watching the mechanics from the 308th Bombardment Group swarm over the aircraft's aluminum skin. They were loading something the 24-year-old pilot had never seen before in 15 months of combat. Not bombs precisely, but 4 500-pound high-explosive packages mounted in hastily fabricated steel racks that looked more like plumbing fixtures than military ordnance. 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns protruded from the bomber's nose and fuselage sides like the quills of an enormous metal porcupine. This was not the aircraft Grayson had trained to fly at Mather Field, California, back in 1941. That airplane had possessed a transparent plexiglass nose, a bombardier, and a Norden bomb sight designed for precision attacks from 10,000 feet. The machine being armed beneath him was something entirely different. A predator built to kill ships at wave-top height in a theater of war where the United States had been losing badly for 18 brutal months. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Captain Grayson did not know that sweltering afternoon was that the modifications bolted onto his bomber represented the culmination of a desperate technical revolution born from catastrophic failure. Within 6 months, aircraft like his would be sinking over 1,000 tons of Japanese shipping every single week, permanently severing Japan's ability to resupply and reinforce their garrisons across the Southwest Pacific. The tactics being refined at primitive bases scattered across New Guinea and Australia would transform the medium bomber from a marginally effective weapon into the most lethal anti-shipping platform of the Second World War. But first, American airmen had to learn a terrible lesson. The doctrine they had been taught, the tactics they had practiced for years, the fundamental assumptions about how bombers attacked ships at sea were catastrophically, lethally wrong. The mathematics of American defeat in the Pacific during the first year of the war were brutally straightforward. From February through December 1942, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchell medium bombers of the 5th Air Force attacked Japanese shipping from altitudes between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, exactly as pre-war doctrine prescribed. The results were disastrous beyond comprehension. Japanese merchant vessels and warships maneuvered easily at sea level, watching American bomb formations from miles below, then simply changing course to place themselves between the falling projectiles. Entire formations of heavy bombers returned to bases in Australia, having dropped hundreds of bombs and scored exactly 0 hits while losing 30% of their aircraft to Japanese fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. During August 1942 alone, 5th Air Force bombers dropped 434 bombs on Japanese shipping and achieved 19 hits, resulting in a 4.4% probability of success. Only 1 transport and 1 cargo ship were sunk. September was worse. Out of 425 bombs dropped, only 9 ships were struck, and only a single cargo vessel was destroyed, yielding barely a 2% hit rate. The human cost was staggering. American bomber crews were being killed for nothing. Young men who had trained for months, flown across the Pacific to primitive jungle airfields, lived in conditions that would have shocked 19th-century soldiers were dying in burning aircraft for the privilege of missing their targets by hundreds of yards. The problem was obvious to anyone actually fighting the war rather than teaching tactics at air power schools in the United States. High-altitude horizontal bombing simply did not work against moving ships. The Japanese vessels could observe American bomb releases from altitude, calculate trajectory, and maneuver out of the impact zone with plenty of time to spare. But recognizing a problem and solving it were entirely different matters, especially in a military establishment that measured doctrinal change in decades rather than days. Paul Irvin Gunn had arrived in Australia on Christmas Eve, 1941, with a mission that consumed every waking moment and rage burning so hot in his chest that sleep became nearly impossible. Just 17 days earlier, his world had been purposeful and ordered. He managed Philippine Airlines in Manila, flying red-painted Beechcraft Model 18 passenger planes across the islands, while his wife Polly and their 4 children lived comfortably in the Philippine capital. He was 42 years old, a former Navy enlisted pilot who had spent 2 decades learning aircraft inside and out, and his future seemed secure. Then Pearl Harbor was attacked, and within hours Japanese bombers were systematically destroying American airfields across the Philippines. General Louis Brereton, commander of the Far East Air Force, immediately commissioned Gunn as a captain and ordered him to use his commercial aircraft for critical military transport missions. For 2 desperate weeks, Gunn flew key personnel and supplies while Japanese forces closed in on Manila like a tightening noose. On Christmas Eve, 1941, he received orders that would haunt him for the next 3 years and 8 months. Fly essential personnel to Australia immediately. Leave Manila. Leave the Philippines. Leave his family behind in enemy territory. Gunn obeyed because he was now a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. But he gave Polly all his military pay plus every dollar he could borrow from fellow pilots. He believed he would return within weeks to rescue them. The Japanese had been stopped before. Surely they would be stopped again. Instead, Gunn watched helplessly from Australia as Japanese forces captured Manila in early January 1942. His wife, Clara Louise, whom everyone called Polly, and their 4 children, Connie, Julie, Paul Jr., and young Nathaniel, were marched into Santo Tomas University on January 4th. The Japanese had converted the university into an internment camp that would eventually hold over 3,000 Allied civilians for the duration of the war. The news shattered Gunn but also crystallized his purpose with absolute clarity. If he could not reach his family immediately, he would win the war faster. And winning the war required solving the problem that was killing American airmen daily while achieving nothing. The bombs were not hitting their targets. Major General George Churchill Kenny arrived in Brisbane on July 29, 1942, to assume command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. The situation he inherited was grim enough to break lesser men. General Douglas MacArthur's forces were fighting for survival in New Guinea, barely holding Port Moresby while Japanese troops advanced across the Owen Stanley Mountains toward Australia itself. The 5th Air Force, formally established on September 5th, consisted of fewer than 500 operational aircraft scattered across primitive bases in Australia and New Guinea, where dust destroyed engines, tropical rain rusted everything metal, and malaria killed more men than enemy action. Maintenance was a nightmare. Spare parts were non-existent. Morale had been shattered by months of defeats. But Kenny was fundamentally different from traditional Army Air Corps generals. He had served as an attack aviator during the First World War, understood aircraft engineering at a practical level, and possessed an unusual willingness to discard established doctrine when reality demanded innovation. Within days of arriving, he began firing officers who could not adapt and searching for men who could improvise solutions with nothing but salvaged parts and determination. On August 4th, Kenny visited the 3rd Bombardment Group at Charters Towers Airfield, south of Townsville in the brutal Queensland heat. Walking through the maintenance area, he discovered a 42-year-old captain working inside the nose of a Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber. The man was installing a package of 4 machine guns taken from wrecked P-40 Warhawk fighters, mounting them to fire directly forward in a configuration that violated every principle of bomber design taught at every air power school in America. Kenny asked what he was doing. Paul Gunn straightened up, wiped the grease from his calloused hands, and explained his theory with the directness of a man who had no time for military protocol. High-altitude bombing was not working against Japanese ships. Anyone with eyes could see that. But if bombers came in low at wave-top height, they could skip bombs across the water into ship hulls like stones across a pond, exactly the way he had thrown rocks across the Arkansas creeks of his childhood. The problem was anti-aircraft fire. Flying straight toward an enemy warship at minimal altitude gave Japanese gunners perfect targets. American bombers would be torn apart before releasing their bombs. The solution was forward-firing guns. Saturate the enemy deck with heavy-caliber rounds as you approach. Kill the gun crews. Suppress their fire. Then release your bombs at point-blank range when the target cannot possibly be missed. Simple, practical. Completely contrary to everything the Army Air Forces had taught about bomber operations for 2 decades. Kenny examined the installation with the eye of an engineer. The guns came from wrecked fighters because 5th Air Force had no spare weapons anywhere in the entire Southwest Pacific Theater. The mounting brackets were handmade from scrap metal. The ammunition feed systems were improvised. It was brilliant field engineering born of absolute necessity. When Kenny learned that Gunn had been an enlisted naval aviation pilot for 20 years, flying from carriers Langley, Lexington, and Saratoga during the pioneering days of naval aviation in the 1920s and 30s, he made an immediate decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. He assigned Gunn to his personal staff as Special Projects Officer, gave him authority to modify any aircraft in theater without requiring approval from higher headquarters, and ordered him to convert 16 more A-20 bombers into strafers immediately. Then Kenny told Gunn he wanted identical modifications on B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, which had longer range and could carry heavier armament. The revolution had begun in an Australian maintenance hangar with salvaged parts and a former Navy Chief Petty Officer who refused to accept that American bomber crews should die for nothing. The B-25 Mitchell had entered service in February 1941 and gained instant fame through the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, when 16 B-25 seconds launched from the carrier. Hornet struck the Japanese homeland for the first time on April 18, 1942. But in the Southwest Pacific, the Mitchell was struggling catastrophically in its intended role as a medium-altitude precision bomber. Its transparent plexiglass nose housed a bombardier with a Norden bomb sight designed for high-altitude attacks against fixed targets. Against moving ships at sea, the bombardier was worse than useless. He was deadweight occupying space that could be used for weapons. Japanese vessels zigzagged constantly, changed speed without warning, and created wakes that confused targeting calculations. Most bombs fell into empty ocean while Japanese fighters attacked bomber formations head-on, exploiting weak forward defenses that consisted of a single hand-operated 50 caliber machine gun in the nose compartment. American bomber crews were being slaughtered while accomplishing nothing measurable. Gunn attacked the B-25 modification problem with single-minded focus that bordered on obsession. Working with Jack Fox, a North American aviation field representative, and the talented mechanics of the 4th Air Depot at Townsville, he began transforming Mitchells into something unprecedented in aerial warfare. First, they removed the bombardier position entirely. The transparent nose was replaced with solid metal structure that could support heavy weapons. 4 fixed 50 caliber machine guns were mounted in the nose to fire directly forward. 2 more were mounted on each side of the forward fuselage. Eventually, some B-25 seconds would carry as many as 14 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns, more offensive firepower than most contemporary fighters. The modifications were completed using whatever materials could be scavenged or improvised. Gun mounts were fabricated from steel plate meant for other purposes. Ammunition feed systems were adapted from multiple aircraft types. The work was done in open-air hangars under tropical sun, with tools that often dated from the First World War. But it worked. The modified B-25 seconds could approach a target at 230 miles per hour at wave-top height and unleash a stream of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that turned enemy deck crews into casualties before they could effectively return fire. The tactical doctrine evolved through practice rather than theoretical planning. Pilots learned to approach Japanese ships from the beam at altitudes between 50 and 200 feet. At approximately 300 yards from the target, they would open fire with all forward guns, walking the tracers across the enemy deck to kill gunners and destroy light anti-aircraft weapons. At 200 yards, they would release their bombs with a 4 to 5 second delay fuses. The bombs would skip across the water surface like stones, strike the ship's hull at or below the waterline, then detonate beneath the surface, where water compression magnified the explosive force. The first large-scale test of these tactics came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea from March 2nd through 4th, 1943. Japanese intelligence had detected the buildup of Allied forces in New Guinea and decided to risk a major convoy to reinforce their garrison at Lae. The convoy departed Simpson Harbour at Rabaul on February 28, carrying nearly 7,000 troops aboard 8 transport ships, escorted by 8 destroyers. Japanese commanders knew the convoy would be vulnerable to air attack, but calculated that the reinforcements were desperately needed and worth the risk. Allied intelligence had intercepted and decrypted Japanese messages detailing the convoy's route and timing. General Kenny assembled every available bomber in the Southwest Pacific for a coordinated attack. On March 2, reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy heading through the Bismarck Sea toward Lae. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses attacked first from medium altitude, sinking 1 transport, but the real destruction began on March 3, when the convoy came within range of the modified A-22s and B-25s that Paul Gunn had created. 12 B-25 strafers, led by Major Edward Larner, approached the convoy at mast-top height. They came in from the beam in 2 plane elements, with one aircraft focusing on suppressing anti-aircraft fire while the other skip-bombed the target. The results were devastating. Within minutes, transport ships were burning and sinking. Destroyers attempting to rescue survivors became targets themselves. By the afternoon of March 4, all 8 Japanese transport ships and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk. Of the 6,900 troops who departed Rabaul, only approximately 850 reached Lae, and most of these had lost their weapons and equipment. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed. Allied losses were 13 aircrew killed and 6 aircraft destroyed in combat. The exchange ratio was so lopsided that Japanese military analysts initially refused to believe their own reports. They conducted extensive post-war studies attempting to understand how a well-defended convoy had been annihilated so quickly, and concluded they had no effective tactical defense against massed low-level attacks by heavily armed aircraft employing skip-bombing techniques. Their anti-aircraft weapons were designed primarily for high-altitude defense. Their fighters could not simultaneously protect against both high-altitude bombers and low-altitude strafers approaching at wave-top height. Their ships lacked the speed and maneuverability to evade skip-bombing attacks conducted at point-blank range. The only viable solution was entirely defensive and strategically crippling. Avoid sending convoys anywhere within operational range of Allied air power. This defensive posture effectively ceded control of vast ocean areas and critical sea lanes to the Allies. It doomed Japanese garrisons throughout the Pacific to progressive isolation, starvation, and eventual defeat through attrition they could not replace. After the Bismarck Sea disaster, Japan never again attempted to send a large convoy through waters where American aircraft could reach them. Reinforcement operations shifted to using submarines and small fast vessels operating primarily at night, methods that could move only a tiny fraction of the men and materials that conventional convoys could transport. Japanese forward forces withered progressively, unable to replace combat losses or receive adequate supplies, while Allied strength grew continuously and overwhelmingly. The success of the modified B-25 at Bismarck Sea validated Gunn's innovations and triggered a fundamental transformation in American anti-shipping tactics across the Pacific. North American aviation began incorporating variations of Gunn's armament modifications into factory-produced B-25 variants. The B-25G model introduced a 75mm cannon in the nose, along with heavy machine guns. The B-25H that followed carried even more firepower with improved versions of the cannon and additional package guns. The B-25J, which became the most numerous variant with nearly 5,000 produced, featured a solid nose packed with 850 caliber machine guns as standard equipment. 5th Air Force squadrons refined their tactics through constant combat experience. They learned that approaching from multiple directions simultaneously overwhelmed Japanese defenses. They discovered that attacking immediately after sunrise or before sunset put the sun behind attacking aircraft, blinding enemy gunners. They developed coordination between strafers and high-altitude bombers that forced Japanese commanders to split their defensive fire between threats at different altitudes, making both attacks more effective. By mid-1943, B-25 strafer missions against Japanese shipping had become systematic rather than opportunistic. American reconnaissance aircraft patrolled constantly, searching for enemy vessels attempting to move supplies and reinforcements along the northern New Guinea coast and through the Bismarck archipelago. When targets were located, strike forces of 12 to 24 modified B-25 seconds would be assembled and launched with fighter escort. The attacks were conducted with precision that would have been unimaginable 18 months earlier, when American bombers were struggling just to hit stationary targets from altitude. The tonnage statistics tell the story of transformation. During the 6 months following Bismarck Sea, from April through September 1943, 5th Air Force B-25 seconds and modified A-20 seconds sank or seriously damaged over 200 Japanese vessels totaling more than 75,000 tons. By late 1943 and into 1944, the weekly destruction rate had stabilized at approximately 1,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed per week through coordinated strikes that left Japanese logistics in tatters. The scale of destruction being inflicted on Japanese maritime operations was unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. Every week, American B-25 crews were eliminating the equivalent of 2 or 3 fully loaded cargo vessels from Japan's already strained logistics network. For an island nation dependent on sea transport to supply far-flung garrisons, this attrition was catastrophic. The Japanese merchant marine, which had entered the war with approximately 6 million tons of shipping, was being systematically destroyed faster than Japanese shipyards could replace losses. The human dimension of this campaign was equally remarkable. Young American pilots, many barely 20 years old, were flying missions that required nerves of steel and split-second timing. Approaching a Japanese destroyer at 200 feet, while that destroyer's anti-aircraft guns were firing directly at your cockpit, demanded a level of courage that defied easy description. The margin for error was measured in feet rather than yards. A momentary hesitation, a slight miscalculation of approach angle, or a mechanical failure at the wrong instant meant death. Captain Robert Strickland of the 38th Bombardment Group flew 82 combat missions in modified B-25 seconds during 1943 and 44. In interviews conducted decades after the war, he described the experience of attacking Japanese shipping with clinical precision that barely concealed the terror underneath. "You came in low enough to see individual Japanese sailors on deck," he recalled, "low enough to watch them manning their guns. You opened fire at 300 yards and walked your tracers up the hull toward the deck. You could see the rounds sparking off metal, see debris flying. Then you released your bombs and pulled up hard, banking away while your gunners raked the superstructure. The whole attack lasted maybe 15 seconds. 15 seconds that felt like 15 hours. The psychological toll was immense. Bomber crews knew that Japanese fighters could drop down on them at any moment during the long flights to and from target areas. They knew that a single well-placed anti-aircraft shell could tear off a wing or ignite fuel tanks. They knew that if they went down over water, survival prospects were minimal. The Southwest Pacific was vast, shark-infested, and largely controlled by Japanese forces. Yet they flew mission after mission because the alternative was allowing Japanese garrisons to be resupplied and reinforced, which would prolong the war and cost more American lives in the long term. The innovation did not stop with armament modifications. 5th Air Force engineers discovered that by removing the lower turret from B-25 seconds and sealing the opening, they could reduce weight and drag, which increased range and speed. They experimented with different bomb loads and fuse settings to optimize effectiveness against different target types. They developed new formation tactics that maximized firepower concentration while minimizing vulnerability to Japanese fighters. The culture that General Kenny had fostered was one of constant experimentation and rapid implementation of successful innovations. Paul Gunn remained at the center of this technical revolution throughout 1943 and into 1944. He flew combat missions regularly despite being in his mid-40s, an age when most men occupied staff positions far from the fighting. He continued modifying and improving aircraft between missions, working alongside 19-year-old mechanics in sweltering maintenance tents. His motivation remained constant and intensely personal. Every Japanese ship sunk was one less asset supporting the enemy forces holding his family captive in Santo Tomas. Every innovation that made American bombers more effective was another step toward winning the war faster and bringing his wife and children home. The strategic impact of the B-25 Strafer campaign extended far beyond simple tonnage statistics. By late 1943, Japanese commanders in New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago were forced to acknowledge that conventional resupply by sea was no longer viable. They shifted increasingly to barge traffic that hugged coastlines and moved only at night, trying to avoid detection by American reconnaissance aircraft. But even this desperate measure provided only temporary relief. American patrol bombers and strafers learned to hunt barges with the same efficiency they had developed against larger vessels. The isolation of Japanese garrisons became progressively more severe throughout 1944. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, Japanese forces in places like Wewak, Rabaul, and Bougainville could do little except defend their positions with dwindling resources. Malnutrition became endemic. Disease spread unchecked. Ammunition and fuel reserves were exhausted. When American and Australian forces finally advanced against these positions, they often found Japanese units so weakened by isolation that they could offer only token resistance, despite still numbering in the thousands. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of B-25 Strafer effectiveness came during the raid on Rabaul Harbour on November 2, 1943. By this point, Rabaul had become Japan's primary naval base in the southwest Pacific, home to hundreds of aircraft and dozens of warships. General Kenny decided to launch a massive coordinated strike to cripple Japanese naval power before Allied landings on Bougainville scheduled for the following day. The attack involved nearly every available bomber and fighter in 5th Air Force, but the B-25 Strafers played the decisive role. Major John Hennebrey led 5 squadrons of modified B-25 seconds in a low-level assault on Simpson Harbor, while P-38 Lightning fighters flew top cover against Japanese interceptors. Approaching at mast height through smoke and anti-aircraft fire, the B-25 seconds attacked 38 Japanese vessels anchored in the harbor. The destruction was extraordinary. Within 15 minutes, 30 ships had been hit, including a heavy cruiser, multiple destroyers, and 16 merchant vessels. Several ships were sunk outright. Many more were so heavily damaged they required months of repair work that Japanese shipyards, already overwhelmed, could barely provide. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Rabaul raid demonstrated that even heavily defended enemy harbors were vulnerable to determined low-level attacks by properly equipped bombers. Japanese commanders had believed that the concentrated anti-aircraft defenses at Rabaul made the base effectively immune to air attack. The reality proved otherwise. The speed and firepower of the modified B-25 seconds allowed them to penetrate defenses that would have shredded conventional bombers attempting attacks from medium altitude. As the Pacific War progressed through 1944 and into 1945, the role of B-25 strafers evolved to meet changing tactical requirements. With Japanese shipping largely eliminated as a significant threat by late 1944, strafers increasingly shifted to supporting ground operations directly. They attacked concentrated Japanese troop formations using parachute fragmentation bombs that Gunn had helped develop. They destroyed fortified positions and bunkers with direct hits from low altitude. They interdicted supply lines by destroying bridges and cratering roads. They provided devastating close air support during amphibious landings and ground offensives. New tactics emerged specifically for these ground support missions. Strafer pilots learned to coordinate closely with forward air controllers who directed attacks against specific high-value targets in real time. Radio communication systems improved dramatically, allowing immediate tactical adjustments based on rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The B-25 Strafer had evolved from a specialized anti-shipping weapon into a versatile attack platform capable of striking any target the enemy presented. The personal story of Paul Gunn reached its resolution in February 1945, when American forces liberated Manila and freed the prisoners at Santo Tomas internment camp. Gunn flew from his base in New Guinea to Manila as soon as the city was secured, desperate to find his family after more than 3 years of separation. What he found was heartbreaking. His wife Polly had died in the camp in May 1943 from malnutrition and untreated illness, just 3 months after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea had validated the tactics Gunn had pioneered. She died not knowing that her husband's innovations were helping to win the war that would eventually free their children. Gunn's 4 children had survived the camp, but they were malnourished, traumatized, and had endured years of deprivation that no child should experience. Connie, the eldest at 19, weighed barely 90 pounds. Young Nathaniel, who had been 9 years old when captured, was now 12 but looked far younger. Julie and Paul Jr. were somewhere in between, physically present but emotionally scarred in ways that would take years to heal. Gunn arranged for their immediate evacuation to Australia for medical treatment and gradually began the process of rebuilding their shattered family. Despite the personal tragedy, Gunn continued flying combat missions throughout the final months of the war. He participated in strikes against Japanese forces in the Philippines and later against targets on Formosa as American forces pushed closer to the Japanese home islands. His technical expertise remained in constant demand as 5th Air Force continued refining tactics and modifying aircraft. By the time Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, Gunn had flown countless combat missions, developed revolutionary aircraft modifications, and trained hundreds of younger pilots in the tactics that had transformed American air power in the Pacific. The 5th Air Force had evolved into one of the most effective combat organizations in military history. Its transformation from the defeated remnants scattered after the Philippine campaign in early 1942 to the dominant air power in the entire Southwest Pacific theater by 1945 was remarkable. That transformation was built on continuous innovation, rapid adaptation to changing circumstances, and the extraordinary courage of men like Paul Gunn, who refused to accept defeat and consistently found ways to win against seemingly overwhelming odds. From the Battle of the Bismarck Sea through the final missions flown in August 1945, 5th Air Force B-25 strafers and other modified attack aircraft sank or seriously damaged over 1,300 Japanese vessels of all types. They destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft on the ground and in the air. They killed tens of thousands of enemy soldiers and continuously disrupted Japanese military operations throughout the Southwest Pacific and the Philippines. The cumulative effect was strategic paralysis. Japan simply could not sustain operations in the region when their sea lines of communication were being systematically destroyed by aircraft they could not effectively counter. The brutal mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side with superior industrial capacity to replace losses, better logistics to support forward operations, and faster innovation to counter enemy adaptations. The United States possessed decisive advantages in all 3 categories. American shipyards were producing merchant vessels faster than German U-boats, and Japanese submarines could sink them combined. American factories were manufacturing aircraft at rates that exceeded total Axis production. And American tactical innovation, exemplified by men like Gunn and commanders like Kenny, consistently outpaced enemy responses. Veterans of 5th Air Force, who had the privilege of flying with Gunn or working with him on aircraft modifications, remembered him decades later with deep affection and lasting respect. In oral history, interviews conducted long after the war ended, former pilots and mechanics consistently spoke of Pappy Gunn as a genuine legend. He was a man who could diagnose and fix any aircraft mechanical problem, improvise functional solutions to seemingly impossible technical challenges, and calmly fly dangerous combat missions that terrified much younger men. His mechanical genius and deep understanding of aircraft systems was matched by hard-won practical wisdom about flying and fighting that could only come from 2 decades of operational experience. The broader lessons from the B-25 strafer story remained operationally relevant throughout the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. The AC-130 gunship that emerged during the Vietnam War was a direct conceptual descendant of Gunn's modified bombers, using the same basic principle of overwhelming firepower delivered from an aircraft optimized for ground attack rather than traditional bombing. Modern attack helicopters and close air support aircraft employ tactics that would be recognizable to B-25 strafer pilots from 70 years earlier, approaching targets at low altitude with concentrated firepower to suppress defenses before striking with precision weapons. The Second World War tested nations and individuals in ways that few historical events have ever matched. For the United States, the test revealed both profound strengths and significant weaknesses in military preparedness and doctrine. American industrial capacity was genuinely unmatched globally, producing war materials in quantities that staggered imagination. But American military doctrine at the war's beginning was often inadequate for the realities of modern mechanized warfare. Pre-war assumptions about how air power should be employed, how bombers should attack ships, how formations should be structured, all these required fundamental revision under the pressure of combat. Achieving victory required learning from failures faster than the enemy could learn from successes. It required adapting to circumstances with creativity and determination. It required improving capabilities continuously while maintaining combat operations. In the Southwest Pacific Theater, that essential process was dramatically accelerated by commanders like George Kenney, who were genuinely willing to embrace innovation, regardless of its source or whether it conformed to established doctrine. Junior officers and enlisted men with good ideas were encouraged rather than dismissed. Field modifications that worked were implemented immediately rather than subjected to endless bureaucratic review. Paul Gunn embodied that innovative culture perfectly. He turned personal need to rescue his imprisoned family into tactical innovation that measurably changed the course of the war. His modifications to the B-25 Mitchell transformed it from a marginally effective conventional medium bomber into a ship-killing gunship that Japanese forces simply could not counter effectively. The fact that he accomplished this using salvaged parts, improvised tools, and mechanics who often had minimal formal training made the achievement even more remarkable. The transformation of the B-25 Mitchell from conventional bomber to strafer symbolizes the fundamentally American approach to warfare during the Second World War. When initial strategies failed to produce acceptable results, Americans adapted. When standard equipment proved inadequate, Americans modified it or built something better. When established doctrine became obsolete under combat conditions, Americans wrote new doctrine based on actual battlefield experience rather than theoretical assumptions. This capacity for rapid adaptation, perhaps even more than superior technology or overwhelming industrial resources, explains American military success. The tactical innovations pioneered in the Southwest Pacific spread throughout American air forces as the war progressed. Units in other theaters observed the success of 5th Air Force tactics and began implementing similar modifications to their own aircraft. By 1944, modified B-25 strafers were operating in the Mediterranean theater, the China, Burma, India theater, and even occasionally in Europe. The concept of the heavily armed attack aircraft had proven its value across multiple theaters against different enemies under varying conditions. Modern warfare continues to evolve rapidly, driven by accelerating technological change and adaptive adversaries who learn from every engagement. Success requires military organizations that can identify emerging problems quickly, develop practical solutions rapidly, and implement necessary changes effectively throughout the force structure. As Paul Gunn demonstrated in 1942, sometimes the best solution is also the simplest. Identify what is not working clearly and without prejudice. Figure out how to make it work using available resources rather than waiting for perfect equipment. Implement changes immediately and refine them through combat experience. The B-25 gunship was not supposed to exist according to official doctrine. Medium bombers dropped ordnance from medium altitude using precision bomb sights. That was the established wisdom taught at every military school and codified in every official manual, published before the war. Paul Gunn ignored that wisdom because combat reality demanded it, and his family's captivity made conventional thinking intolerable. Japanese ships were not being sunk by high-altitude bombing. American bomber crews were dying for no measurable result. So Gunn created something entirely new from salvaged fighter parts, tested it in combat because there was no time for proper evaluation, and proved that determined individuals can accomplish extraordinary things when courage meets necessity and refuses to accept defeat. The weekly tonnage figures tell a story beyond mere statistics. 1,000 tons of Japanese shipping destroyed every week during 1943 and 44 represents not just metal and cargo lost, but Japanese soldiers who never received ammunition, food that never reached hungry garrisons, fuel that never powered aircraft or vehicles, medical supplies that never treated wounded troops. It represents the systematic strangulation of Japan's ability to wage war across a theatre encompassing millions of square miles. And it was accomplished primarily by young American crews flying aircraft that had been modified in primitive jungle workshops by mechanics, improvising solutions with whatever materials they could scavenge. By war's end, the modified B-25 had become an icon of American aerial innovation. Photographs of the heavily armed strafers appeared in newspapers and newsreels across America, symbols of American technological adaptability and fighting spirit. The aircraft appeared in training films, in technical manuals, in official histories. But the men who had flown them knew the reality was far grittier than the public image suggested. They knew about the fear that gripped your stomach approaching a Japanese destroyer at wave-top height. They knew about the friends who simply disappeared during missions, their aircraft disintegrating under anti-aircraft fire or spiraling into the ocean with one wing shot off. They knew about the primitive conditions at forward bases, where dysentery and malaria were constant companions, and hot food was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Yet they also knew with absolute certainty that what they were doing mattered. Every Japanese ship sunk was one less threat to Allied operations. Every enemy garrison isolated by lack of supplies was one that could be bypassed or defeated more easily when ground forces arrived. The strategic impact of their efforts was visible in ways that crews in other theatres rarely experienced. They could see Japanese bases withering from lack of supplies. They could observe enemy aircraft remaining grounded for lack of fuel. They could watch Japanese troop concentrations growing weaker month by month as reinforcements failed to arrive. The story of American B-25 crews sinking 1,000 tons of Japanese shipping per week in the Southwest Pacific is ultimately a story about human determination overcoming institutional inertia. It is about practical men solving practical problems with whatever resources were available, rather than waiting for perfect solutions that might never arrive. It is about innovation emerging from necessity under the pressure of combat against an enemy who had proven they could be defeated if Americans were willing to discard assumptions that no longer served. Paul Gunn died on October 11, 1957, when his plane crashed in a storm over the Philippines. He had returned to the islands after the war and rebuilt Philippine Airlines. The company he had managed before the war destroyed his family and changed his life forever. He was 57 years old and still flying, still innovating, still refusing to accept limitations. His funeral in Manila was attended by hundreds of people, including many former servicemen who had flown with him or worked alongside him during the war. They remembered him not for his rank or his decorations, but for his determination, his mechanical genius, and his absolute refusal to give up no matter how impossible the situation appeared. The lessons Gunn taught through example rather than lectures remain relevant today. Technical problems require technical solutions, not just better doctrine or more resources. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources and should be encouraged regardless of where it originates. Combat is the ultimate test of effectiveness, and weapons or tactics that fail in combat must be discarded or modified regardless of how much institutional investment they represent. And perhaps most importantly, Individual determination and expertise can have strategic impact when given the authority and resources to succeed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.